David is Associate Professor of Paleontology at Montana State University. He has a bachelor's from Cornell, a master's from the University of Georgia, and then he came to Montana State University to obtain his PhD, where he is today. His research focuses on the biology of dinosaurs and largely involves theropods, which most of you will know today as living dinosaurs are birds. And he in particular focuses on the Cretaceous of Montana. And I was pleased to see when he talked about that in his interest and what he focuses on, that he still talks about the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, which strictly speaking is no longer correct. It should be the KT. But though for those of us who are, say, more than 10 years out of school, it's still the KT boundary. So he says that he tries to blend anatomic and geologic data within a broad evolutionary context. He has three main areas of research at the moment. Taphonomic studies, which for most of us that means after-death processes, transport, burial, fossilization of things like dinosaurs. The dinosaur Troodon, which he will be talking about tonight, and dinosaur reproduction, in particular that of the theropod bird lineage. He has a strong, stable past and current graduate students, a long list of publications, and not surprisingly, most of them are about dinosaurs. So without further ado, I'm going to ask you to help me welcome David Varricchio.
John, thank you for coming out and having me here today. So this image is a little bit outdated, right? Probably we should have feathers on Troodon from what we know of other dinosaurs, but I kind of like his attitude, so that's kind of I focused on that. So I'm going to start with this guy. Do you know who this is? I thought we'd start with a geologist, since I was talking to geologists. Did anyone proffer a guess? Yes? No, he's not a paleontologist. He did geology in this area, famous for doing geology and sort of geographic surveys of this area. It is. It's Ferdinand Hayden, correct. Yes. So Ferdinand Hayden is connected with Troodon Formosus. So Ferdinand Hayden, in 1867, he becomes sort of the leader of the United States Geological Survey, surveying the territories of the United States at that time, which represented a big chunk of the American West. So he's going to lead around 12 trips out west, basically these expeditions to survey the American West, beginning in 1867. The most famous is sort of the survey of the Yellowstone area in 1871, which leads to the establishment of Yellowstone National Park, the first national park in the US, and some people say the first national park anywhere, in 1872. But when he was a young man, the story is that he actually walked to college. So he lived in Rochester, the Rochester area in New York, and then went to college in Oberlin, Ohio, and walked to Oberlin, Ohio. I don't know how true that story is, but the biography that I read said that's how he got there, is he walked to Oberlin, Ohio. He went to college there. After that, he came back to New York State, went to med school in Albany, New York, and when he lived there, he resided with the New York State geologist, and as a resident there, under this man, he got the geology bug, got interested in rocks and minerals and fossils, and he was kind of debating, should I continue in this medical career? But I'm just sort of intrigued by the geology and natural history. So he does finish his medical degree. He'll be a doctor for the Union during the Civil War. But before that, he gets this bug to go out and do collecting, sort of natural history collecting. So he writes to Baird, who's a researcher at the Smithsonian. He says, "I'm willing to go anywhere for any length of time and labor with utmost diligence. Few obstacles will present themselves which I would not cheerfully overcome, and were it necessary to accomplish my purposes, I could live as the wild Indian lives and endure any amount of exposure and toil without a murmur. So Baird takes him up on this and basically sets him up on an independent collecting trip up the Missouri River, which at the time, actually when he leaves, so the trip is going to be for 18 months, 1854 to 1855. He's going to take a paddle boat from St. Louis up the Missouri River into what's now Montana. And at the time when he leaves, the area is just unorganized territory. It doesn't even have a name. It gets a name while he's en route and becomes the Nebraska Territory. There's not much going on in Montana at that time, so the only non-Native American settlement is Fort Benton with about 100 people. So it's some soldiers and some trappers, and that's it. There's nothing else in Montana outside of Native Americans. So it's sort of an unusual time for someone to go out there and say, oh, I'm going to walk around and collect fossils in the middle of nowhere. But he gets there. He says it's a glorious country for a naturalist. So he enjoys collecting natural specimens and geologic rocks, minerals, as well as fossils. He loses some important items when they fall off one of the boats, as well as his field book. So we don't really have records of that. But he wrote a lot of letters back to Baird at the Smithsonian during that time. One of the quotes I like is this one: I used to wander off alone 5 miles from the river with a bag in one hand, pick in the other, a bottle of alcohol in my vest pocket, and with a gun to defend myself from Indians and grizzly bears. Later on that year, he writes, the Indians are exasperated. I can assure you that what I do hereafter will be at the peril of my life. And that's true. There's an encounter with, so he has hired Native Americans to help him, and there's actually an encounter with other Native Americans, and two of his assistants are killed in that encounter. So it is serious business in some ways, even though he's out there, what seems kind of silly, collecting dinosaur fossils. So he collects a number of teeth and other geological specimens and sends them back to Baird. And among them is this curious tooth here, just one tooth like this. And he sends it back, and it ends up with Joseph Leidy, who's a paleontologist in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences. And he names a new animal, Troodon Formosus, which means beautiful wounding tooth. Kind of an oxymoron, perhaps, I don't know. Based upon this tooth. So it's distinctive enough that Leidy thinks it's a new animal. But it's only one tooth, and so for about 130 years, we don't really know what Troodon Formosus is. Leidy thought it was some kind of lizard, like a monitor lizard. Some people, like Cope, suggest maybe it's a dinosaur. And it's really not until the 1980s that we figure out what Troodon actually represents. So Troodon is a theropod dinosaur, so it's in the group that contains all the carnivorous dinosaurs, so T-Rex, Allosaurus, Spinosaurus, Velociraptor of Hollywood fame, everything, all the theropod dinosaurs are there, all the carnivorous dinosaurs are there. Troodon is not a particularly big dinosaur, it's sort of a person-sized, I say sort of small person-sized. Its hips would be about level with our own hips. Might weigh something about 125 pounds. It does have unusual teeth. Some people think that that the teeth, there it goes. The teeth have these big serrations that may have eaten plants, or maybe it's an omnivore, or maybe it's something else. And then Troodon's kind of famous for having a big brain, so this is part of the brain case. So this space in here houses its brain. And so for its body mass, Troodon is one of the brainiest dinosaurs, so maybe that means it's one of the smarter dinosaurs. This reconstruction shows it to have lots of feathers. Probably it should have feathers, but we really don't know how they should be arranged, or the colors, or the ornamentations. It is a raptor. You can't really see it in this picture. So it does have this enlarged claw on its big toe that makes it a raptor. And then, so it's two-toed, and actually the long bones of its foot are sort of deer-like in their proportions. Right? If you've ever seen the cannon bone of a deer, it's kind of long. It's basically two bones fused together. This is actually three bones fused together. This inner one would house the retractable claw, and then these are the two running toes, the third and fourth digit that are there. So Troodon, as I said, is a theropod. It sits among, I guess I should use this since we have two screens. It sits among all the carnivorous dinosaurs, but Troodon in particular sits close to birds and is one of the closest theropods to birds. So it's sort of one of the closest dinosaurs we have to birds. I'll talk about this other animal, oviraptor, which is also sits close to the ancestry of birds as well. Not as close as Troodon, but pretty close as well. So we're kind of focused on this area. I have to get used to this mouse here. On this area close to the ancestry of birds. All the specimens I'll talk about come from the Two Medicine Formation. So that's a geologic unit in western Montana, close to the Rocky Mountain front. Dates to about 75 million years ago. It's sort of west of Great Falls or Shoto, Montana. It's an area that Barnum Brown explored in the early 1900s, but Jack Horner kind of made it famous for his work there beginning in the late 1970s and into the 1980s. One of his most famous finds was Maiasaura, a duck-billed dinosaur. It's now the state fossil of Montana. And he found Maiasaura eggs, he found Maiasaura embryonic remains, and he found them in interesting arrangements, sufficiently that he could argue that Maiasaura cared for its young in the nest. So the young hatched out of sort of grapefruit-sized eggs and remained in the nest for several months under the care of the parents. So Maiasaura has the name the good mother dinosaur. He's done additional work on the bone structure that sort of corroborates that interpretation. So as John said, I came out to Montana State for my PhD, and it was kind of Jack Horner's work, kind of answering biological questions that drew me to Montana State. So I was actually Jack Horner's first graduate student at MSU, which I guess makes me old. So why study dinosaur reproduction? So Jack, I think, sort of Maiasaura kind of represents a couple of reasons for that. It's just kind of an interesting part of their biology and ecology. So if we're interested in dinosaurs, it's sort of a natural component of their biology. But maybe on a larger scale, maybe it tells us something about the success or failure of dinosaurs, why they, were dominant creatures on the Earth for 160 million years ago. Maybe it explains something about, why they went extinct, perhaps. And then as we move to the origins of birds among carnivorous dinosaurs, maybe it says something about how reproduction in birds first evolved or where it first emerged from. So we have a really great suite of fossils for Troodon, and almost a complete set, I'd say, of what we want to see in terms of reproduction. So we have nice Troodon eggs. We have Troodon egg clutches, so this is a group of 24 eggs. And actually this clutch of eggs sits under this plaster jacket, and then this is a nest trace, so a structure built by Troodon around the egg clutch. We have Troodon embryos, so bones inside the egg itself, and then we even have an adult Troodon that was found at the top of eggs. If I could add one more thing to this wish list, it would be an adult with eggs inside it. So we're still. One thing really cool about egg clutches is that they're really unique fossils. And why I say that is paleontologists talk about body fossils. You can think of those as bones and teeth. It could be a leaf fossil or a clamshell, right? Those are all skeletal remains or remnants of the actual specimens themselves. And then there are trace fossils, which are the signs of animal activity preserved in the fossil record. It could be a worm burrow, it could be a footprint, right? So we have the bones of the foot are the body fossil, but a footprint is the trace. So if you go hiking around here and you're worried about bears, you're looking for bear traces, right? Footprints, scat, claw marks on trees. Those are all traces of bear activity that you might want to see before you proceed down the path. So dinosaur egg clutches are really cool in that they combine body fossils and trace fossils, right? The egg itself is a body fossil. It has anatomical components to it that reflect how it was created in the mom. They reflect the incubation environment for the embryo, right? So they're important about how the embryo functions. So an important aspect of eggshell, of eggs, is the eggshell nature. So we can look at the pores, right? So if there's an embryo inside this egg, it has to pull air in, it has to exhale out, it has to deal with water loss or gain through that eggshell membrane and the eggshell pores as well. So it sort of functions, as part of the development structure for the developing embryo. But then we also have the egg arrangement, right? So the adult has placed those eggs in the ground, presumably with some significance for how they're going to be incubated. So for me, they're really cool fossils in combining anatomical information with behavioral information as well. So I'll come back when we talk about Troodon features. So basically I'm just going to walk through the different fossils we have for Troodon and talk about their significance for Troodon reproduction. So here is an embryonic bone. This is the femur or thigh bone for a Troodon. And this is important because it allows us to identify this egg and this egg type as belonging to Troodon. We have lots of dinosaur eggs. If you've ever seen pictures of eggs from China, there's tons of eggs. And we have lots of dinosaurs, but we actually have very few that we can match up and say this egg belongs to this specific type of dinosaur, right? So we don't have T-Rex eggs, we don't have Triceratops eggs, we don't have Allosaurus eggs. The vast majority of sauropods, we don't have eggs. So we have a dozen eggs that we can say this belongs to a Troodon, this belongs to Maiasaura. So very few examples. So that's really important for that identification. And then Jack looked at these bones, I guess, almost 30 years ago, and he looked at the bone tissue. So he cut up some of these bones, and he identified Troodon as having precocial young, meaning the bones were well formed in the embryo, and so when it hatched out, it could run around. So you can think of like a chicken, like a chick hatches out of the egg, and it's good to go, as opposed to, say, a robin that hatches out and it's largely featherless and it kind of just flops around, and it's really dependent on mom and dad to be fed and kept warm as well. Whereas the chicken hatches out, it's got feathers, it can run, it can't fly yet, but it can at least run around and it feeds itself. So Troodon, based upon the embryonic bones, was a precocial, had precocial chicks or young. We're also investigating Troodon embryos in other ways, so we went to my colleague Martin Kundrat in Slovakia, took this, I think it's a very humble looking egg, it doesn't look particularly good, we just sort of got lucky. He took it to the synchrotron in Grenoble, where you can sort of shoot it with high-powered beams and scan the interior, and this is what he got. He basically got an entire Troodon. This is probably the most complete Troodon we have ever found, and it happens to be an embryo inside an egg. But here's the femur, and here's part of the tibia, and here, this is sort of the distinctive metatarsals. I don't remember I pointed out those metatarsals before. It runs on those two outer toes, and the third little one in the middle, it's actually number 2, supports the retractable claw. They're embryonic bones, so they're not complete. But we're hoping to gain some insight about Troodon growth by looking at these bones on the interior. He's pulled out some of the bones from that mass. So here it's basically sort of the right arm kind of sitting like this, and the right leg kind of folded up, right? Imagine the embryo's kind of tucked inside there. The embryo's head's kind of tucked between his legs. So I think this will play. Maybe I have to go to my computer. So this is basically a 3D scan. So the dark blue is the thigh bone, the femur, and then these two bones here, that's the tibia and fibula, that's the shin bones, and here are the long bones of the foot. So we can kind of look at how this animal, if you want to see it, I like it, so see it one more time. Anyway, so we can begin to look at the morphology of the embryonic remains without ever having to extract them from the rocks. And actually the synchrotron can see details that we can't pick out with the naked eye under a microscope. So you can't really prepare the fossils as well as you can with the scanning imaging. So the scanning imaging presents better morphology of the bones, and hand preparing the specimen largely damages the bones. So we have an entire skull. So this is the embryonic skull. So this is kind of where we're going with some of the research, is to compare the embryonic skull with the adult skull to look at how proportions change. Maybe that'll tell us something about the evolution of troodontid species. So that's sort of an area of investigation. I'll point out, though, that we have some teeth. So all these little gray things here are teeth that are falling out of the jaws within the embryo. These are sort of a scattering of teeth there. We'll come back to those teeth in a bit. Troodon eggshell. So here are cross sections, thin sections of the eggshell. So if you're familiar with petrographic thin sections, this is basically just petrographic thin sections of Troodon eggshell, so cross sections. I think I'm out of power, maybe, or did I pull something out?
Use this one then. I will split.
So the cool thing about Troodon eggshell is that in thin section it looks pretty much like that of a modern bird. So here's a goose and a Troodon eggshell. In comparisons, they both have this lower layer called the mammillary layer. Troodon, it's a little harder to see because of the they're sort of infilling other minerals, but it still has this kind of cone-shaped or barrel-shaped bottom to it. It has what's called a continuous layer, and it has a third external layer. So if you had found a piece of eggshell of Troodon and you didn't know what age it came from, you'd sort of guess, oh, it's a bird, because it has the same anatomical structure. And that suggests that Troodon's reproductive tracts are functioning like that of a bird, right? That it basically has the same, it's basically, the product is the same thing. Oh, I'm having so much trouble. Okay. So presumably that means that its reproductive tracts are functioning in a very similar way to that of a modern bird, because it's producing the same crystalline structure as in the modern bird. Troodon eggs are asymmetrical like a modern bird, so they have kind of a pointy end and a blunt end. These two eggs, they're sort of crushed in part by they're kind of crushed by lithostatic compaction, but they have this pointy end down here and kind of a broader blunt end up top. They're smooth surfaced like a modern bird egg. A lot of dinosaurs have bumpy ornamentation on their eggs. So the shape, the smooth surface, and they're relatively large for the size of Troodon. So they weigh 300 grams. I don't know what that is equivalent to, 300 grams. 454 grams is a pound. So it's, what is that? It's like 12 ounces. So it's a fairly substantial egg, right? So it's about yay big. You can see someone's holding those there. A couple of differences, though, are that they're very elongate eggs. And that's a form of eggs that we really don't see among modern birds, right? So they have this kind of long aspect ratio to them. And they're not quite as big. So if you had a bird the size of Troodon, it would produce an egg that's about twice the size of the Troodon egg. But Troodon eggs are about 10 times larger than what a reptile the same size would produce. You can think like a Nile crocodile, which is really huge, produces an egg that's the size of a duck egg. And then Troodon clutches are really cool. And again, remember I said that Troodon clutches are neat because they have anatomical features, but they are traces, right? The adult place these eggs in this pattern. So that tells us something about reproductive behavior. So there's three things to highlight about Troodon egg clutches. First, they're big. So this clutch here has 24 eggs. And if you add up the mass of that relative to the adult mass, it's a big clutch. And whether you take a modern reptile model or a modern bird model, it's about 3 times larger than expected, right? So if you had a 125-pound bird or 125-pound reptile, their clutch would weigh about 1/3 of the Troodon clutch. So that's kind of interesting. And then the second part is that is the orientation of these eggs. So if you can think of, so they're sort of standing upright in the ground. So we have a side view there and a top view. So if you think of my forearm as a Troodon clutch, here's the blunt end, here's the pointy end, right? They're planted in the ground and they lean in towards the clutch center. So in top view, you see the tops of the eggs close together, but in bottom view, which is the next slide, they'll sort of fan out, right? So here's that side view kind of shows them angling in. The top view shows all the egg tops sitting sort of next to one another. And here's the sort of the third interesting aspect of Troodon clutches, is that the eggs occur in pairs. So if you look at that, you can kind of like look at both the spacing of the eggs and also sort of the trend and plunge for you geologists, right? Sort of the angles in which the eggs are placed in the ground. So this is the bottom view, right? So they're angling in towards the clutch center, right? And so they kind of fan out in this view. So it's kind of interesting to think about this in two ways. One is like, how did they actually do that? How did they plant eggs into the ground, elongate eggs? That seems like an odd, do they wiggle their butt into soft sediment? Do they dig up the soil and then use their hands? Can they actually grasp an egg? I don't really know. Do they nudge them around with their nose? How do they actually plant them in the ground? Do they construct something from the center? And the other question is, why are they laid in pairs? Why is there this paired pattern? So we can look for modern animals to kind of help us with that interpretation. So the typical anatomy for a vertebrate is to have 2 ovaries and 2 reproductive tracts. So that's true in reptiles, it's true in most mammals. I don't know if there are any mammals that don't have 2 ovaries and oviducts. So that's sort of the standard anatomical condition of most vertebrates. Reptiles produce lots of small eggs, and they lay them all at once, typically, right? So they, like this crocodile, digs a hole one night, deposits all its eggs, or a sea turtle on a beach, digs a hole, deposits 100 eggs, and buries them. Birds are unusual in that one side, I think it's the right side, fails to develop. So they embryologically, they have 2 ovaries and oviducts, but only one matures and is functional as an adult. And so they produce only 1 egg at a time. So another difference is that they produce their eggs iteratively, right? The fastest a chicken can lay eggs is 1 per day, right? There's lots of people out there trying to make chickens lay faster eggs, but all they can do is lay 1 egg per day, and then the next day they ovulate another egg, form the other egg, and lay the second egg. And another aspect, though, is that they make really big eggs relative to the reptiles, right? So this, if we had a chicken there, maybe a chicken would be a better diagram. Kiwis produce giant eggs. But if I had a chicken, relative to that Johnson crocodile, its eggs are about the same as the Johnson's crocodile, although it weighs, it's a 3-pound chicken and an 80-pound crocodile, something like that. So they really lay much larger eggs and lay them 1 at a time. So our interpretation of our Troodon clutch, this pairedness, is that they have the primitive condition of 2 reproductive tracts, 2 ovaries and oviducts. They're functioning like a bird's. Remember, we had the same kind of eggshell structure as evidence that they're functioning like a bird's. So they're producing 2 eggs at a time. So they lay 2 eggs on one day, and then have to wait maybe a day, maybe more days, to lay the next pair of eggs. Big birds, like an emu or an ostrich, can't lay eggs one day after the next. They actually have to wait since they're producing such a big egg. So basically we're saying that they have two reproductive tracts, kind of the primitive condition, but they're functioning more like a bird's. There are a couple oviraptor specimens that actually have been found with 2 eggs internally or sort of quasi-internally. So that kind of confirms that interpretation. So we came up with this interpretation based on the egg clutch, and then now there's sort of anatomical skeletons that kind of confirm that in oviraptors. So we think we're on safe ground there with that interpretation. Then we have the Troodon nest. So again, remember that this is a nesting trace built by the dinosaur. So this clutch of 24 eggs is under the plaster jacket, right? So it's arranged those eggs in this weird near upright posture, planted in the ground. In this case, it's preserved as sort of a critic limestone. And then it was mudstone that kind of buried both the tops of the eggs and the nesting structure. So again, it's like you wonder, like, how did it actually build this nest structure? So is it using feet or hands? How did it implant those eggs? Those are questions I really don't know, but like to think about. in a sort of arm wavy kind of way. So there's a student of mine did these drawings to think about how it might have constructed the nest. But then we can ask about how is it used functionally as for incubation, right? And you might think there might be three possibilities here. They could bury the eggs in sediment, right? Maybe like a sea turtle coming up on a beach. It could create a vegetation mound within this nest structure. So some alligators, right, they build these vegetation mounds. They don't have sediment bases, but they do make big vegetation piles and lay the eggs in there, and that rotting vegetation provides some heat for the eggs. Or it could be using this nest structure more in a bird-like fashion and actually sitting on top of the eggs. So we can look at incubation strategies by looking at porosity. So those modern animals that bury their eggs completely, which is most reptiles, but there are a few birds that also bury their eggs in strange vegetation mounds or in sand. Those eggs are in this enclosed environment, circulation's poor, so they tend to have very porous eggs to kind of enhance the ability of the embryo to pull in oxygen and get CO2 out. And they don't really have to worry about evaporative loss of water, right? They're in this closed, humid environment. They don't really need to worry about water loss in that case. And then most birds, and there are some geckos too, that lay exposed eggs. So the geckos kind of just plant two eggs under a leaf or in a crack in the bark. They tend to have very low porosity eggs, right? The airflow is much better when they're exposed, and there's more risk of losing too much water to the outside environment. So typically there's a much lower porosity in those nesting with exposed eggs. So we looked at Troodon eggs. We basically sampled the eggshell from top to bottom. You take tangential sections, so not cross sections, but tangential sections. So this is a section here, a tangential section, and this is one of the pores in the eggshell there, just next to the red dot there. And you can see there's not very many pores. And it turns out that the overall porosity of Troodon eggs is equivalent to modern birds that brood their eggs, that basically have exposed eggs and sit upon the eggs. So our interpretation is that kind of supports the other evidence, I would say kind of arguing from the nest structure and the sedimentology, that we kind of thought that they would brood their eggs given this sort of trace, but the porosity kind of corroborates that interpretation. And then we did find this one adult, and you can see I don't have good pictures of nice, beautifully preserved, articulated skeleton, because it was kind of messy, both in the Cretaceous and with recent weathering, so it was kind of atop these eggs, but not in any kind of nicely perched position. But it's kind of a nice association anyway. It had bite marks on it from some animal chewing on it, so it went through a lot, that skeleton, but at least it was associated with the egg. So our interpretation is that Troodon sat upon its eggs and brooded them in sort of a quasi-bird-like fashion. It's a little unusual in that the eggs are largely buried in the ground. So birds typically rotate their eggs, right? They're sitting, they're underneath the adult, we'll call it a pheasant, right? And the adult can rotate the eggs to move them around. Some people that say that that's good for aeration or heat transfer. And they have special cords called chalazi that allow the embryo to rotate in there. If you ever watch like documentaries on sea turtle eggs or crocodilian eggs, when people go in there, they're going to salvage these sea turtle eggs and incubate them in a lab. When they collect them, they mark the upside. And that's because the embryos in those animals actually adheres to the eggshell. And so if you rotate it over, you could actually kill the embryo at certain times in development. So we suggest that maybe Troodon lacked these special features, the chalazi, and basically had to implant the eggs so they would never move, but they could still sit on them. We don't really have any proof of that, but that's kind of our argument. And then how long would it take Troodon to incubate its clutch? If you take a bird model and given that size egg, it would take something like 44 days. If you take a reptile model, there really aren't any reptiles that have eggs that size, but it probably would take something like 107 days, so something in the order of 3.5 months. So it's a fairly substantial time. There's one way to kind of estimate incubation time, and again, this goes back to the synchrotron in Grenoble and scanning embryonic remains, and that is to look at growth lines, daily growth lines in embryonic teeth. So our own teeth, while they're developing, lay down the dentine in daily growth lines. Those are called lines of von Ebner. And so you can actually go in there and you take a thin section or scan and count the number of growth lines and say, oh, it took X number of days for this tooth to grow. So that's what we did with this Troodon tooth. The tooth is very small, 1.9 millimeters long, so you can see how small that tooth is. But you can go in there and you can count these fuzzy lines of von Ebner. So you can kind of see some good ones here and some better ones up there. It's a little fuzzy there, so you're going to have to move the scope around to collect them all. But if you do that through the whole section, right to this tooth tip, you get an age of the tooth of about 42 days. And crocodiles develop their last set of teeth around 50% of the way through incubation. So it's a way to kind of estimate incubation period for the animals. So Troodon predicts an incubation period of 74 days for Troodon, which is kind of interesting because that's kind of halfway between the bird and the reptile, and the way they're laying their eggs is sort of not quite like a bird's because they can't really get around the eggs completely. Presumably they would lose a lot of heat, because the eggs are buried in sediment down here, that they're sort of transferring heat and it's sort of lost to the outside environment through that way. So it's kind of an interesting number to find. Oviraptors, as I said, there's another group closely related to birds, and they share a number of these features. So it's kind of nice to sort of have evidence in corroborative animals. So they have big clutches, and the eggs are arranged in pairs. You can kind of see the nice pair here. Nice trouble on that side. Where am I over here? Here's a nice pair, nice pair. So they have really good pairing. No one ever disputed whether they had pairs or not. There's beautiful specimens like this specimen here collected by the American Museum in the 1990s, perched atop the eggs. So people say, oh, well, they're clearly brooding or guarding the eggs. So we see some similarities in oviraptors. They also have large eggs and elongate eggs like Troodon. Oviraptor, right, the name means egg stealer, and so it's kind of gotten a bad rap. The first oviraptor ever found, which was found by the American Museum in the 1920s, was found atop eggs. So they thought those eggs belonged to Protoceratops, and so they thought it was the egg stealer. It was stealing Protoceratops' eggs, but now we know it's actually brooding its own eggs and not stealing any eggs. So we see some special things within animals close to the ancestry of birds, right? They have really big eggs for their body size. They're elongate. They're arranged in pairs. They seem to have this kind of weird brooding with the eggs partially buried in the ground. That actually, we have evidence in Mesozoic birds, Cretaceous birds, for that as well, that the eggs are elongate and planted in the ground, either sat on by the adult or maybe just simply buried and incubated by soil. And that's all very different from what we see in most other dinosaurs, where we have round eggs, the eggs are much smaller, they have a high porosity indicating that they were buried. So we see some sort of shared features with birds among these carnivorous dinosaurs close to the ancestry of birds. But there's definitely a gap here, whereas as far as we know, all Mesozoic dinosaurs, non-avian dinosaurs and the birds, bury their eggs at least partially, where modern birds typically don't bury their eggs. So there's some gap here in reproduction there between Mesozoic animals and modern birds. But we have a whole diversity of dinosaur eggs that we really haven't studied well, and they suggest that there's a variety of reproductive behaviors among other dinosaurs outside troodontids and oviraptors, and they may be doing all sorts of different things that we have yet to figure out. Their eggshell microstructure is radically different from anything today, so we don't really know how to explain those unique aspects. So let's go back to our Troodon clutches. So we have a Troodon clutch that was found with an associated adult, and there are several examples of oviraptor clutches found with associated adults. And we can ask who was doing the care, who was taking care of these eggs? And by that I mean which sex? Was it the female, or the male, or both involved in taking care of the eggs? Now, sort of the knee-jerk reaction is that, well, it should be mom, right? That sort of makes sense. She laid the eggs, she should sit on the eggs. And so when the American Museum found these specimens, They found the first one and they called it Big Mama, right? They found the second specimen, since Big Mama was taken, they called it Big Auntie, right? So clearly, this was not a scientific, interpretation. This is just sort of field stuff. And just, when they found the field, it was curious. But I think it kind of represents our inherent bias, right? So we're mammals, and mammals in part are defined that moms nurse their young. So that's true in all mammal species. And so in 95% of mammalian species, it's mom only that takes care of the young. And 5% is mom and dad that take care of the young. But mom is always involved. So if you think like a mammal, then mom makes sense sitting on these eggs. Now if you were a fish, you might interpret it differently. So fish, the most common care strategy among fish is paternal, male-only care. So there's mouth brooders, and there's seahorses, and they look after the young. So if you ask the average fish, they might say, oh, that should be Big Papa and Big Uncle or something. Right? And so I bring that up because we're sort of biased in our perspective. If we look at dinosaur relatives, there's sort of ambiguity there too. So crocodiles largely have female-only care. So mom tends the nest during incubation. Most reptiles, though, have no care. Like you think of the sea turtle leaving its eggs on the beach. Birds, we have two main groups of modern birds. Most are biparental, mom and dad. You think of like a robin or Canadian geese or sandhill cranes. But then the other group is largely male-only care, like rheas and emus and cassowaries. So there's sort of four different options, and they kind of surround dinosaurs, so it's kind of hard to say which one is favored. So we try to get at this by looking at Troodon egg clutches and oviraptor egg clutches. Remember we said that they're really big. They're like something like 3 times larger than expected. And Jack Horner noticed that when he first described Troodon eggs in 1987, and he thought, well, maybe they represent communal eggs, multiple females contributing to one nest. You can think of egg clutch as one measure of parental investment, right? If you think about reproduction, you could say, I'm going to lay one big egg, and I'm going to really invest a lot in that egg. I put a lot of energy into making the egg, and I'm going to care for the young when it hatches out. Or I could be like the crocodile, I'm going to lay 80 eggs, they're much smaller, and I'm going to care for the young a little bit. Or you could be like the sea turtle and lay 100 eggs and leave them on the beach. But I'll lay 3 sets of 100 eggs, so I'm going to lay 300 eggs a year, and they can scramble to the shore and get picked off by seagulls. But as long as a couple survive, I've done my job, right? So there's different ways to invest your energy when it comes to reproduction. So we looked at a host of modern birds with my colleague Jason Moore, and the method is called generalized estimating equation-based phylogenetic comparative analysis. It basically means we collect a lot of data from modern animals, plug it into some kind of model, and see where our dinosaurs should fall out. So we looked at a variety of modern animals. We looked at clutch size, the condition of the young when they hatch out, are they precocial or altricial, mating strategies, parental care mode, things like that. And we often include who's related to who in that analysis as well. And it turns out, though, that the best interpretation for Troodon is that it should have male-only or paternal care of the young. So that's 4 times more likely than any other type of care strategy. So really, those animals sitting atop the eggs should be the papa rather than the mama. That's kind of interesting because a lot of the animals like that, like emus, they do have large clutches. And so they have this mating strategy called polygynandry, which means that a male mates with multiple females. He creates a spot where he's going to have his nest. The female, their only investment in reproduction is to create eggs, right? So they drop an egg off with him, they go feed, come back in a couple days, 2-3 days, drop off another egg, right? So his females bring him the egg, and he protects them. He sits on the eggs. It takes him 44 some days, 47 days, something like that. He doesn't eat, doesn't drink. They hatch out, and then they follow him around as a little, flock of young that hop around. Females typically go on, once that male has completed his clutch, to mate with another male and lay eggs into another male's clutch as well. So they'll contribute eggs to multiple clutches. So that's why it's called polygynandry in the fact that one male mates with several females and a female mates with several males. There's something here I'm forgetting. So it's kind of interesting. We had these big clutches. Jack Horner kind of proposed that maybe they were communal, and maybe that's what they reflect. And the reason you can get big clutches is because the female, all her energy is going into producing eggs, right? She's not devoting any energy into sitting on the clutch, and no energy into the care of the young after they hatch. All her energy is eggs, right? That's all she's doing. And so you can get lots of eggs. Remember, these are 3 times larger than you'd expect. So that says something about the ancestry of modern birds. Among ornithologists, they often debate what care strategy came first from our dinosaurs. It kind of argues that this male care strategy was the ancestral condition for early birds, and that biparental care is something that evolved from a strictly male-only care strategy. So just in summary then, Troodon, some interesting aspects of Troodon reproduction. It produced 2 eggs at a time at intervals. It buried its eggs half in the ground. It's kind of weird. Sat on them, incubated them by the adult. It appears that it was the male that sat on the eggs. It may have sat on the eggs for as much as 74 days in this kind of transitory system that's where the eggs are partially buried. So it sort of suggests that a number of features, egg production, eggshell, egg shape, had its origin within carnivorous dinosaurs, but modern birds are different in that they incubate those eggs completely free of sediment. Another important aspect is that Troodon and Oviraptor, their reproductive strategy is different from all other dinosaurs, right? All the dinosaurs have round eggs. They're probably buried in the ground. They're not laid in pairs, but maybe they do have multiple ovaries and they're laying them in pairs, but we haven't found iterative evidence in those things. So other dinosaurs are doing different things than these carnivorous dinosaurs. So Maiasaura was the good mother dinosaurs, the state fossil of Montana, and it may turn out that Troodon may actually be the good father dinosaur. So, thanks for your time. Yes, sir.
Is there any evidence do you have any evidence as to whether the eggs were incubated right from the time the first eggs came in, or did they wait until all of them were?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And in most birds that have precocial young, so his question is, did they incubate from the get-go, when the first ones were laid, or did they wait till the clutch was finished? So a turkey might have a clutch of 20 eggs or 15 eggs, and their young are precocial, right? So they hatch out and run around. So what the female does is she doesn't sit on the eggs until the clutch is completed. And so the eggs come out at body temperature, then they sit there at environmental temperatures, it's cooler, and the embryos remain in stasis. And then when the clutch is completed, she sits on it, temperature goes up, and that synchronizes the hatching of all those young. And so when they hatch out, all of them can follow around. Because you imagine it would be bad if she sat on the eggs, one hatches out and runs around, and another one hatches out and runs around, and they have 2, and they're two different sizes. So I kind of use that as an argument that Troodon elevated its temperatures. So I think it has precocial young, it has iterative laying, and I feel like those things kind of go together with it actually brooding. That you need that cooling down period and then warming up when the adults sat on it. So I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the notion that they brooded their young, that iterative pattern plus precocial young. Yes, ma'am.
I think that chickens have an air sac.
Yes.
Do these animals have an air sac?
We don't really know that yet. Yeah.
What is an air sac in this context?
So the young hatch out, and there's like a little air sac that develops. I think the membrane pulls away from the shell, and so they can actually sort of breathe in the egg late stages prior to hatching. Yeah. Some people think that you can look at some of the eggshell, some aspects of eggshell would reflect the presence of an air sac. And we haven't really done that work. birds extract calcite from the eggshell, and where that pulls away, they can't really extract it. So it should sort of, you should be able to see etching on the other parts of the egg and not that egg. So you'd have to kind of go back and sample all the eggs all the way around. Yes?
So Troodons have been found in Slovakia and also in Montana?
No, he's just a colleague that does the scanning. So I send him the eggs. And so they haven't been really found in Europe. There are troodontids in Asia, Mongolia, and China. And they have some paired egg patterns to them. And the eggs are also planted in the ground. So they show the same. Actually, the eggs are much smaller, and they're smaller species of troodontids, members of the family that live there. But the same pattern kind of persists in the eggs are kind of this weird, planted in the ground, lean to the clutch center, and you can find a paired pattern too.
How long would a Troodon live, do you know?
So they have the growth, there's growth lines in the bones. And so the one that was found associated with the egg is something like 18 years old, if our interpretation of these lines of arrested growth are correct. So that's our oldest animal that we have. Yeah. It would take about 5 years to reach full size.
So there's no anatomical measure to kind of predict how many eggs one of these dinosaurs would lay during its breeding season?
Not
I'm not
really,
sure
because
everybody can say that. I'm not sure everybody can hear that over here.
okay, he asked. Say it again.
Oh, so I asked if there was an anatomical measure to predict just how many eggs one of these dinosaurs would lay during its breeding season.
Yeah. I don't know if we've explored that, we being the general paleontologist. I mean, I guess the challenge there is whether you're, the challenge is if dinosaurs, do you assume a bird model or do you assume a crocodile model and then go from there? Yeah. The challenge is that bird bone is structurally really different because of flight, and crocodile bone is really different too. So I mean, like Troodon bone looks more like a mammal bone in cross section than to either birds or crocs. So it would be, yeah. Where did you want to go with that? Just think about.
Oh well, if it's a communal nest and you have multiple
Yeah.
laying in the same nest, and then my second part of the question was, do you see any other communal behavior? Like, are there any sites where you have multiple dinosaurs just close to
Some. I mean, we certainly have bone beds of different types of dinosaurs, but there's no real bone bed for Troodon. There's one site that has a bunch of Troodon, but it's kind of messy, and I'd be hesitant to say that they all died together as a group or something. Yeah.
But just the two eggs together made me think it's like, oh, maybe there's another female coming in and she laid the two together.
Yeah. Yeah, it's curious to know how that pattern's created and why it's preserved.
Why feathers and when did they fly?
Why feathers?
One would think that, they, like we use down, it's warm.
Yeah, so
but
that's-
then when did it turn into something that flew?
Yeah, so we have, if you go in the theropod family tree, more primitive theropods, there's some small-bodied ones that are chicken-sized, and they have kind of simple hair-like feathers. They may split a little bit, but they're not as complex feathers. So most people would say that they're for insulation or perhaps kind of display as well. And then as you move closer to birds, they become more complex and more bird-like. They develop the central rachis, is that what it is? And the barbules and stuff like that. So they develop that morphology, and some, initially they're symmetric, and then they become asymmetric like the flight feathers. There was a troodontid described from China that has asymmetric feathers. It has asymmetric feathers on its forelimbs and its legs. And actually, when it was first described, it was thought to be a bird. But there's sort of examples of these other animals that may have climbed trees and then leapt from the trees and used these long feathers from all their limbs. We have no skin impressions or skin fossils for Troodon. So it's hard to know whether you should put lots of feathers on it, downy feathers on it. You could kind of do whatever you want with as far as artistry goes, but we don't really have evidence one way or the other.
So if they had 2 reproductive tracts, do you think these eggs were produced in tandem and then laid 2 by 2?
Yeah, I think they kind of emerge one at a time. So there's geckos that have the same kind of reproductive pattern, where they ovulate one egg from each side, form those eggs, and then they lay a pair, and then they actually have to wait several days for the next pair, and they don't lay them together, but they like go tuck them, hide them somewhere else, and so they lay another pair. So it's sort of that. So that pattern does exist in nature, of kind of the iterative paired pattern.
2 by 2 though.
Yes, 2 at a time.
So did I understand correctly that the building of vegetative ground nests is a fairly recent innovation?
That's a good question. I would say from probably within birds, you mean? Or
Yeah, within birds.
within birds, yeah. Like where it's like a scrape and they line the eggs. I guess I'd say that there's challenges with preservation. So it's easier to find eggs that are buried in the ground. And when we recognize a scrape with eggs in it that then got buried by some flooding event, we'll be able to pick out that as like a surface nest versus a closed nest versus an open nest. So that's kind of why we rely on the porosity of the eggs. So I would say from Mesozoic, it seems like nobody had fully exposed eggs like a modern.
Well, I can understand why there's preservation problems, but I guess one of the implications would be, if that's true, that it's a recent innovation, is would it tell us something about average hemispheric ground temperatures between the Pleistocene and the Mesozoic?
Oh, I don't know.
And what would that mean in terms of
Yeah.
population rates?
Yeah, I mean, some of the Troodon and oviraptors, it may be special to, particularly warm temperatures in the Cretaceous, might make that more suitable, or might favor that half-buried arrangement that other climates wouldn't have. Yeah, I don't know.
Can you talk a little bit about the depositional environment where these are found and what kind of rock? They seem incredibly well preserved.
Yeah, the Egg Mountain area, it's fluvial deposits, usually interpreted as floodplain deposits. Egg Mountain specifically is kind of weird. It's this thick, massive unit that kind of goes back and forth from more mudstone, sort of like macritic mudstones to muddy micrites, in an irregular fashion. And there are soil invertebrate traces throughout that suggest it was kind of like a terrestrial deposition, sort of floodplain environment for some sequence, and that's kind of where we find the most Troodon clutches. Kind of alkaline rich, So the idea is that it's actually the time of maximum regression, so we had sort of drier soils. So the two medicines kind of sits mountainward relative to the Cretaceous shoreline, and if you go towards the shoreline, you get more coals and organic rich deposits, and presumably conditions there that were slightly acidic, where eggshell wouldn't be preserved, but these alkaline rich deposits seem to be, have the right chemistry to preserve eggs. And I think because the micrite is probably forming at shallow depth, that it preserves the three-dimensional form of the eggs. Because when we find eggs in Montana elsewhere and they're in mudstones, they're just pancakes and kind of squished. Whereas the Troodon eggs within these micrites are fairly three-dimensional, although you can still see some kind of telescoping that got compacted there.
Yes, I may have missed it, but specifically, what did they eat?
That's a good question. There's a lot of debate about Troodon because it has this weird, it has lots of teeth, 130 some teeth in its jaws at one point. It has those big serrations. It's among carnivorous dinosaurs. Some isotopic work suggests it's strictly carnivorous, but some people say that maybe it ate plants or insects, given the weird shape of its teeth. I guess I kind of think that, although I'm one of the people that said maybe it ate other things, I kind of lean towards carnivory. One paleontologist suggested that it has these really big eyes and binocular vision, that maybe, and it has kind of delicate feet. It has, even though it has this retractable claw, the rest of its foot is built more like a deer. So he argued that it really wasn't built to tackle big game, but maybe mammals and lizards and smaller animals. There's one site where there's baby hadrosaur bones. This was described by a Canadian paleontologist. It's a collection of baby hadrosaur, duck-billed dinosaur bones, and a lot of Troodon teeth, like it had been eating those. So small game might be the best. It's a long-winded version to get to that. Sorry.
David, you said there was a significant gap in evidence for nesting types early on in your talk. So dinosaurs, theropods, and then later you see the modern types of processes. And I'm just, so two questions, I guess. The first is, when do you first actually see fossil evidence of modern bird behavior, if you will, in the fossil record in the tertiary? And if it was happening all the way back into the Cretaceous, is maybe just not very well, not easy to preserve?
Yeah, the record of the modern bird groups in the Cretaceous is really slim. It's a few isolated bones that are debated, like, oh, I found a fragment of something related to parrots or something like that, one jawbone. And generally, it hasn't really been regarded. There's one good specimen from Antarctica. So we really don't have modern bird groups well represented at all in the Mesozoic. We have these Enantiornithians, it's the dominant bird group of the Mesozoic, and they go extinct with the Cretaceous. And we actually have lots of eggs for them, and they look like they either were nesting like Troodon, elongate eggs planted in the ground, and we have a couple adult specimens on top of them, or they were buried completely in the ground and just soil incubated. I'm not sure I'm answering the question. So the modern, I don't really know when we get good evidence in the tertiary of modern nesting. There's Presbyronis from the Green River, and we find lots of eggshell there. There's lots of baby bones and adult bones, but I don't know if there's ever been like a nest structure. They're sort of washed together along the lake margins. I don't know if porosity has been done on those eggs. That'd be a good question. I've been thinking about this, whether we need to sort of check early birds in the Cenozoic about their porosity to see if they're all exposed, or maybe some of them are still buried.
How many peers do you have, paleontologists who are studying birds globally, do you think?
There's a fair amount of people that study birds, but not,
In the fossil record?
In the Mesozoic, they, like this group over here about that, There might be 20 people that specialize in Mesozoic. I don't really specialize in Mesozoic birds. Not very many. There's a Dinosaur Eggs and Babies conference. It's a very specialized group, yes. And that kind of has, 30 presenters or something like that. Well, thank you very much.
The drill is the